So a while back, my sister asked if I could recommend a film camera that she could bring with her on vacation trips. And I was like, yeah, but I can do better. I have a camera and lens that you can have for free. Now, if you've watched my other videos, you may recognize this camera as the $5 XG-M that I ordered from KEH. But despite denying me an affiliate link, I guess someone must have been watching, because now they want $84 for a bargain grade one. So initially when I had inspected this camera, I determined that it was fully working aside from the mystery goo that was keeping the on-off switch from toggling properly. But upon further inspection, I discovered that the meter is mildly cooked, which is to say it's like 2 full stops out of whack, but still technically functional. So let's see what else we can find wrong with this thing. Let's start by removing the top cover, which is fairly straightforward. If you've done one camera, you've done them all. So I won't spend too much time retreading old ground, but it is important to watch out for this plastic spindle that holds the exposure compensation dial. This is the most common broken part aside from the infamous capacitors, and basically if this is broken, camera no worky, because it holds conductive brushes down to a resistor band that sits underneath. And it's really annoying to try supergluing the spindle back together. Ask me how I know. I'll preemptively replace the electrolytic caps beneath the upper board by first desoldering the rainbow mess of spaghetti so I can peel back the PCB. And it's a good thing I did, because as you can see, the caps aren't looking too great. There's already quite a bit of corrosion on the legs of the first capacitor and the surrounding traces. I guess I've got some work to do, so I'll hand it over to my loyal assistant Gums, who will act as a set of helping hands. It's just a matter of extracting the old caps and performing a somewhat half-baked job of cleaning the corroded areas, trying to avoid rendering further damage to the traces. The cap closer to the blue tantalum one at the top is 4 volt 22 microfarad, and the one that sits below it is 4 volt 33 microfarad. They're supposed to be 6.3 volt caps according to factory spec, but this is what I had on hand and I knew they would work. The voltage in the circuitry should theoretically never exceed roughly 3 volts. This is kind of an oversimplification, but spoiler alert, I was right. They just maybe won't last quite as long. These are kind of a pain in the ass to place, because if they're not in just the right position, you usually can't get the PCB or top cover to sit back in place properly. Sometimes they can be forced into submission, but then you risk damaging the legs or the solder pad, which you really don't want to do. There was another questionable trace that I also decided to jump, this time requiring a much longer wire to go from the underside to the top of the PCB. Goes up here. Then of course I did all of the boring stuff like adjusting the meter and shutter speeds with the corresponding potentiometers, which are all now dead accurate. At this point, I'm cleaning the 50 odd years worth of grime and corrosion off the camera using my ultrasonic cleaner, which is really great for removing everything but what you actually want it to clean. In this case, it did a pretty good job, and all we're left with is some pitting in the nickel plating. At this point, I wanted to do something a little bit custom, and I know my sister's into this shiny blue color. So I got this clear blue paint that I've been itching like a little fiend to try out. So I mixed this up 1-to-1 with 97% isopropyl alcohol, because this is a solvent-based paint. I used to use lacquer thinner, but that stuff is pretty evil, and my brain doesn't really need to be more cooked than it already is, which I'm exemplifying very well here as I spilled half of it while test spraying. But everything's working, so I'll do a few coats with my clapped out China Tech airbrush until I achieve the desired depth of color. Thanks to my ultrasonic cleaner, I'm also redoing the black painted lettering as well on both the faceplate and the shutter speed dial. This is just cheap acrylic paint, which I found to actually be quite effective in the recessed areas like this, which don't receive a lot of wear. It's much easier to work with than a thin enamel or lacquer, and it's both easier and cheaper to mix up custom colors. Upon reassembly, it occurred to me that I missed a few prime candidates for the clear blue, so I went back and painted the advanced lever screw cap and shutter release collar. From the front, I like the blue on the advanced lever, but I feel like it's like kind of too much when viewed from above, so then I undid my additional work. I was planning to pair this with the 50mm f2, but that lens has a little small patch of fungus in the front element, and then I remembered I have an extra 50mm f1.4, which also has the exact same problem. Of course, this one also has the added issue of a loose focusing grip, but I think I have a solution to that. First, we'll remove the front lens barrel, which requires loosening a hidden set screw, which will wreak havoc on the threads if you don't remove it first. As far as I'm aware, all of the MD2 lenses and beyond will have this. Now we can remove the front element and focusing ring, which are held in place by 3 screws. We'll then turn the lens over to remove the flange, which is held on by 4 screws and gives access to the rear lens group. After unscrewing that, we can see the 6-bladed aperture, which is held closed by a tension spring. We'll pop the aperture ring off, making sure not to lose the tiny ball bearing that engages the click stops when turning the ring. Good luck finding that if you drop it on the floor. Here I'm making marks across all the parts that make up the double helicoid to make sure I have everything clocked correctly for reassembly. The metal tab gets removed and both parts of the helicoid can now be unscrewed. Now let's remove the aperture blades, which are held in by a metal clip, which is held in by a few screws. I'll gently dump the aperture blades. Okay. All right, maybe not so gently. And there we go. I think we got them all. At this point, it's just a matter of removing the last few random pieces to prep the painted parts for cleaning. I'm throwing them in a container to soak in isopropyl alcohol, which should remove or at least soften up the paint in the lettering. At least that's what's worked for me in the past, so we'll see if it works this time. We'll then take all the lens components and throw them in my ultrasonic cleaner with a diluted degreaser to remove all of the pre-existing helicoid grease, grime, and hopefully the softened paint. With a bit of scrubbing with a soft bristled toothbrush, the rest of the grease was removed fairly easily. Hey, remember what I was saying about ultrasonic cleaners? Unfortunately, the anodization on the aluminum lens parts decided to fuck off, so I guess now we'll have to determine a solution for that. Of course, the best part of all this is that the lettering is still alive and well. All right, well, I guess we'll just have to roll with it. And by that I mean scrape it out with a needle. At first, I was going to repaint the now partially stripped aluminum parts, but then I had a better idea. So I began to remove whatever remained with sandpaper, which was taking entirely too long to do by hand, so I figured I'd give the Dremel a shot. This is a tool that I've had forever, but really haven't used all that much over the years. It's funny, when I got this as a kid, I thought that a rotary tool was like the ultimate DIY machine, until I realized that it's kind of just okay at doing a bunch of different things. Which means, while it's not the best tool for any one thing, it is the most relatable tool. Eventually we're left with something that resembles relatively smooth, so I'll move on to some brown polishing compound and a small buffing wheel. We'll then follow it up with a finer green polishing compound to get as close as my patience will allow to a mirror shine. Though I could have done a better job, it looks like the Dremel proves itself useful for polishing. So we'll give this a coat of the clear blue to match the other parts and move on to detailing the rest of the stuff while this dries. I'm using more of the cheap acrylic paint straight from the tube, which matches the hue decently, but I wasn't quite happy with how it was reading against the black plastic. After mixing a few different tints, I was able to achieve something that was much more visible against the black while retaining the hue as closely as possible. Over the clear blue, I decided to do the lettering in white, which, despite leaving for a very short amount of time, managed to stain the paint underneath. So I had to strip everything off and try again, but then the alcohol pitted parts of the aluminum, so I had to polish it again. The main issue is that the Tamiya clear blue isn't really durable enough for what I'm doing, so I'll try mixing it with clear enamel in the world's dirtiest jar. After waiting 3 whole days to make sure the paint was as cured as time would allow, I managed to get the result that I was looking for. All right, now onto the focusing grip conundrum. In order to make this, I'll head over to my friend's shop to raid his metal offcuts and use his machine equipment. Looks like the failed focusing knob from my Yashica project will do the trick, so let's slap it in the drill press and start doing some sketchy shit. If you're wondering what the hell I'm doing, so am I. I think what I'm trying to do here is add a radius that can sit against the barrel of the lens in order to save time spent shaping the aluminum later. But how will we cut this down to the correct width? Oh, I know. How about this metal cutting bandsaw? Surely this will work on a part that's this small. Yep, looks like I'll have to alter my approach here. But with the power bestowed by a set of vice grips, anything is possible. Well, you know what they say, if it works, is it really the wrong way to do it? Or maybe that's just me. I will now convert the bandsaw to vertical mode to cut out a section of the ring. And after a single failed attempt, I determined that I would not be continuing to pursue that method, and we would move back to the Dremel. I'll do sketch shit, but I won't do shit that sketchy. Back home at my workbench, I'll hand it over to my trusty assistant to hold the aluminum in place while I use a grinding wheel to cut the desired section. That is, until the screw holding it onto the mandrel sheared off, an unsurprising L for the Dremel. Ah yes, now this is what I'm used to. So instead, let's try the multi-purpose cutting bit, which seemed to do a little bit better of a job until it also broke. But since we still have half a bit, let's see if we can finish the cut. And to my surprise, it actually managed to do it, so now we can use a sanding drum to flatten the rough edges. I printed out a circle that matched the diameter of the focusing ring so I can roughly trace the curvature onto the tab, after which I'll move back to the sanding drum to shape the curvature, which was working okay until the part started to heat up so much it was burning the leather on the vise and burnished the sanding drum to the point that it was unusable. I'm starting to see a pattern here. I guess I'll just have to do the rest by hand, which I valiantly attempted for about 10 minutes until I cracked and went to the hardware store to purchase another mandrel to finish the job. Now it's looking pretty alright, so this is the fun part where I get to go back to sanding forever until I can finally polish it up and move on to the lens reassembly, starting by relubricating the helicoid with number 30 helicoid grease. This is simply preferential. You can get lighter or heavier grease depending on the desired feel of the focus throw. Of course, I wasn't happy with how rough it was feeling, so in the process of trying to make things smoother, I dropped the painted part on the concrete floor and chipped the finish in 2 or 3 different places. As you can imagine, I was a little bit upset by this, and my workbench cabinet was the unlucky recipient of my frustration.
Are you feeling mad? Yeah. Are you feeling kinda sad, dude? Yeah.
Now we still have some damage control to do, so I'm going to attempt to sand back the chipped areas and blend in new paint, which didn't really work at all, so I ended up removing the paint and redoing it again. But more problems persist, and after an extreme level of cleaning, I still could not get the helicoid to run smoothly, which led me to conclude that I must have somehow damaged the threads. So in a last-ditch effort, I decided to try polishing any potential burrs off the threads using a nylon cleaning wheel and green polishing compound. Surprisingly, it actually worked pretty well, and after another round of insane cleaning, I can finally put the focusing ring back on. But with a project like this, one can only go from bad to worse, and despite my better judgment, I chose to use super glue to try adhering the focusing tab, which resulted in a terrible mess and irreparable damage to the paint on the tab, which I then had to repaint. Again. That's not good. Fuck, man. With my now non-existent level of patience, I thought it would be best to switch gears and continue the lens reassembly with the aperture ring. After adding new grease, I can replace the spring and the tiny ball bearing.
Fuck.
Alright, well that's gone forever, so let's see if I have an extra one in my Minolta parts bin. Nope, okay, let's check my other Minolta parts bin. Nope, okay, must have used them all. But I recently received a comment from a viewer saying that the ball bearing from a ballpoint pen can be used as a replacement, so we're going to test that. After struggling to remove the ball bearing for a few minutes, I suddenly remembered that I have yet another parts bin. Silly me, it's almost like I have way too many spare parts laying around. And this one actually yielded multiple ball bearings. So now I can show you how to avoid yeeting the tiny bearing into oblivion. First, take some grease that you wiped off your workbench because you forgot to close the tube and accidentally leaned on it. Now all you have to do is coat the end of your tweezers and you can move the ball bearing and put it into place without holding it under tension. But this bearing is too big, and I don't have any other spares, so there's only one thing left for us to do.
I'm sorry, little one.
Alright, now we're good to go, but let's not forget this tension spring for the aperture stop down. Now we can replace this metal stop tab and slather the detents with grease. The aperture ring isn't too difficult to put back on, you just have to press the ball bearing in so that it doesn't pop out and go flying while you're pressing the ring into place. Now we can drop the aperture blades back in, and since this is only a 6-bladed aperture, it's fairly easy to do. Then again, anything feels easy when you've done an aperture with 10 or more blades. And now we can drop the backing piece back in, making sure everything locks into place. You actually have to have everything clocked correctly here so that the aperture blades will fully open and close at their respective settings. It can require a bit of trial and error, but it's not too difficult to do. Next, the retaining ring and screws to keep everything held securely. Now we can screw the rear lens group back in and put a dab of paint on the screw for the tension spring to make sure it doesn't slip off. Last thing on this side is the lens flange, and then we can check the aperture to make sure everything is together correctly. The front lens group gets secured back into place, and then we can replace the front shroud, making sure to set the grub screw back in the correct position. With the lens reassembled, I'll paint in the focusing scale and other details. I'll glue the lens mount indicator back into place using a tiny amount of contact adhesive, which was still too much. I'll be using the same adhesive for the focusing tab, which is what I should have used to begin with. Of course, the paint wasn't fully cured, so my overhandling once again damaged the finish on the focusing tab, but I'm just so over it at this point that I'm not redoing it again. So fuck it, it's staying. Alright, now let's apply the focusing grip before I change my mind. I'll first cut it to size and then apply contact adhesive to both parts using a firm application to seat it in place. Somehow I managed to cut it slightly too short despite measuring and leaving excess, so there's an annoying gap on one side of the scuffed ass focusing tab. There's a gap. All it needs now is a cleanup of the fingerprints and residue, and with that, I'm finally done with this little bastard of a project, so let's take a look. So anyway, yeah, I'm pretty happy with the way it turned out in the end, despite the unlimited amount of setbacks, but this wasn't really what I had set out to do at first. It just kind of spiraled into craziness, and then I was like, alright, well, I guess I'll just make a long form video out of it. But it was cool to experiment nonetheless. So if you like this video, consider subscribing to follow along on more of my misadventures. And until next time, later.